you all for joining us. I did not intentionally wear a yellow sweater with a yellow background, but it happened like that because it's a Monday. So we're going to rock with it and keep going. First, we want to just say thank you for folks for joining. We know you're taking time out of your day. We're going to hear from members of the Equity Working Group first. And so then you'll hear from us, and then we'll go through the agenda and expectations.
That sounds great. Thank you, Nicole and Aja. Raisa, do you want to kick it off, or shall I do that?
I can kick it off really quick and talk about quickly what the Racial Equity Group is, and quickly introduce our two hosts for the day.
So you're asking?
Aja and Nicole. Okay, so the Racial Equity Group sits within the EFA project. We are made up of folks from the Energy Foundation, National Housing Trust, Natural Resources Defense Council, Faith, the leader, great leader of our NEWHAB network, and then also we act the New York chapter. And we formed last year initially to think through how racial equity shows up in our work and where we can start doing a little better, start diving in a little deeper, recognizing that everything that we touch is also touched by systems of oppression, namely racism. So when we're thinking about housing and housing policy, there's obviously the effects of redlining and other things, environmental impacts, largely kind of Black and minority and Hispanic neighborhoods are more likely to be closer to places that have negative environmental impacts. And so we brought on two consultants. Those are Aja and Nicole. They are rock stars in this arena. We're really, really lucky to have them. They're going to be humble, but everyone knows who they are, and they are mentioned in books. Yeah, they're really great. And so I'll let them introduce themselves. And then Faith, do you want to take it from there?
Yeah, thank you, Raisa, and good morning, everybody. Just here on the West Coast, it's still morning, and it's a Monday morning, so bear with me a bit. But I just wanted to take a moment to step back and welcome everyone, and thank you so much for joining. I think there are some folks on the call that aren't as familiar with EFA and NEWHAB, so I just wanted to set the stage a little bit with what this initiative is and how we are all united. And then just second what Raisa said about racial justice being central to our work. So Energy Efficiency for All works to ensure that all renters, regardless of income, race, or ethnicity, live in a home that is affordable and healthy. We unite people from different backgrounds and different sectors to work collectively towards making affordable homes energy and water efficient. The theory is by reducing energy and water in affordable homes, we're helping families thrive by relieving the economic and environmental burden on those that have just been overlooked for far too long. EFA does this work through 12 strong state-based coalitions of partners that are from diverse sectors and perspectives, and a national network, the Network for Energy, Water, and Health in Affordable Buildings. NEWHAB is open to all individuals who are working to ensure affordable, healthy, sustainable housing for all. So we know racial justice is central to our work. We know that to get to the world we envision, one where energy equity and housing as a human right is a reality, we have to address the persistent structural and institutional racism in our systems, as well as the cultural and personal bias that lives within. So today is a continuation of that conversation that we've been having in our state coalitions and in our national network. And it's a step along the path that we charted for ourselves in the Equity Manifesto that we developed. And in that manifesto, we declared that we are an anti-racist network committed to taking risks to dismantle unjust systems in measurable ways. To dismantle structural racism, to get there, we must first learn together and align. And so I'm really excited to be on that path with all of you today. Clearly, there's a lot of interest in this, and our guides, Aja and Nicole. So take it away, ladies. Thank you.
Thank you. What a beautiful framing. And Raisa, you're so generous with your introduction. So one of the things that we can promise you all is that this is going to be as interactive as we can be on a webinar. And so you'll get out what you put in. The degree to which you can ask questions, engage with us, will make the time fly. We are really excited to be working with the Equity Working Group and think that that the network of partners and organizations who comprise IFA and NEWHAB have a lot of potential and power to really think about the work they're doing differently. And so we wanted to just kind of talk a little bit about what we can promise by the end of this webinar. So one, we're going to introduce a framework to understand and assess your work through a racial equity lens. We'll be able to articulate definitions, and we'll talk about why definitions and key terms are really important in conversations about racial equity. And we'll begin, I can't promise that you'll have a full understanding, right? That we're talking about systems and structures that have outlived a lot of us. So I don't know if everyone's going to walk away with like a clear, really neat, nicely packaged idea of how this work impacts their own work. But you'll begin that conversation, and that's a conversation that we'll be in with you all over the next year. And then you'll have a better understanding of why IFA is engaging in racial equity work. And I think to Faith and Raisa's point, like this is central, right? Sometimes we think about racial equity and racial justice work as being like some other work that exists out. It's like after you do all the things that you're supposed to do, right? Racial equity work is like an add-on. It's like a nice to have. And what we would argue is that it's central to the work of your organizations. And so by prioritizing it and building your capacity to engage in these concepts, you're actually doing the work. And so we'll go through just a quick agenda. We'll talk a little bit about, we have already done that, about who we are and where we are in the process, why IFA and NEWHAB are looking at racial equity. We'll break down racism, right? We'll just like give you like some definitions and terms to have a framework of operating and understanding. And then we'll talk about the relationship between power and race. We'll have some time to practice with concepts, and then we'll open it up for a Q&A and close out. Sounds good to folks? Great. Oh, I love it. Look, see, you guys are getting this interaction thing.
So why racial equity? One of the things that came up even when we were having our day-long meeting with the IFA working group was really getting clear about why IFA was starting with racial equity when there are so many other places of inequity, right? Gender, sexual orientation, citizenship status. So one of the things that we know is that all of those things interact. And what we would argue, and we're grounding it, the two quotes that you see on the slides are what we want to use to ground this discussion. But starting with race, right? And I'll just quote Michelle right here. We start with race, the most taboo and unreconciled American subject, so that when racial or other inequities surface, we can recognize, disrupt, and rebuild. So this idea that by starting with one of the most taboo conversations, and frankly, one of the most difficult conversations to have, that when we begin to look at other systems of oppression, we want to be able to, and we want other folks who we train with or talk to be able to recognize those intersections, to be able to look and say, oh, that's not just a woman, but that is a woman of color, and that means something different. And then also, just so Tim-wise, when you allow racial disparities and institutional inequity to impact one part of the country, eventually it's coming back to get everyone. So also this idea that racial equity is the work, and that it is something that impacts us all, is really one of the sort of grounding concepts that we want to talk about here. So we've been working with the IFA working group, and Nicole is going to talk a little bit about the interviews that we did.
Yeah, so one of the things that we start with the premise is that that people are rich sources of data, and that oftentimes as consultants who are external to organizations, one of the best things that we can do is to begin to be in conversation about what's already being done, what are the conversations that people are already familiar with, so that we can ground our interventions in what is already happening in the networks and organizations. And so we've already interviewed leads and partners in the regions about their perceptions of IFA's racial equity work. We did a day long with the equity working group to get on the same page about definitions, to do some assessment building, to just see where people were, to spend some time in conversation so that the partner organizations that create the networks could be in conversations about what was different and unique about their own organizational positions, right? That those things are not, everyone is not in the same place, and that's not a good or a bad thing, but sometimes you want to surface those things so that you can deal with the tensions as they emerge, instead of being like, I thought we all had a really common definition, or I thought we all were committed to this work. And so we also have done some developing of preliminary tools. The glossary is one of those. And then what we have found out, right, is that there's this real tension that exists in the organizations that create the network between people who say we have technical policy expertise, and that is what we act on and move on, and then trusting the lived experience expertise of the people who are impacted by the issues that the organizations who comprise a network work on. And then there was some agreement, right, that there's a commitment to racial equity. Like we know that there's a commitment to equity and racial equity, but we don't have a shared understanding of what that means. And then there's no explicit declaration. We heard that, and we could argue the merits of like, is that true? Is that not true? But I think that when people tell you what they're experiencing, we have to believe them at their word. And so if that is not reinforced in communication, or people hear it one time and then it's not revisited, that can be where some of that information comes from. And that people wanted clear metrics for assessing the impact of their racial equity work, and that there was a lack of clarity about how members in regions buy into racial equity work, which is interesting to me, given number two, right? That people were like, there is a commitment, and then they're also like, but we're not clear about how, as members and institutions and regions, we buy into that commitment, or we fit into that piece.
So we keep talking about racial equity, but what is it, right? So we like to use a definition from organization Equity in the Center that says that racial equity is the condition where one's racial identity has no influence on how one fares in society. Racial equity is just one part of racial justice and must be addressed at the root causes and not just at the manifestations. This includes the elimination of policies, practices, attitudes, and cultural messages that reinforce differential outcomes by race.
And I would add that sometimes this is where we see organizations struggle, right? Is because we want to treat the manifestations of race-based outcomes. So there is the disproportionate outcome, and we say we're going to solve for that outcome, and then we don't look at the root causes. And so what we invite you to consider in all of the work that you're doing is, are we treating the symptom, or are we treating the root cause? And those answers are not, they're not linear, right? Those are not things that are just like, you answer that one time and then you never revisit it, or you answer it for this and then it's not for that. We would invite you to try on, like, is this a racial equity solution? Is this an equitable response? And that is an ongoing work, that it gets refined over time.
And I would add that it isn't necessarily one or the other. So a lot of times we like to use the example of a hospital. And I don't know if anyone else watched House. I was personally obsessed with the show. So House, right, was at this hospital. And you had people who came in and they were seen in the emergency room for their immediate needs, right? They were like, my leg's falling off. I need you to come and make sure my leg's not falling off, right? So in the ER, they'll make sure your leg's not falling off. But you also need a Dr. House, right? So, because sometimes your leg's falling off, we fix that, but we're like, but why was your leg falling off in the first place? And you have a Dr. House or a diagnostician that comes in and is like, these are the root causes. So one of the other things, and we'll talk about this later, in terms of sort of advocacy, organizing, and direct services, this isn't to say direct services aren't necessary. So like those of folks who are in the network who are like, we make sure housing gets built. That's critical, right? Because people need housing. meeting that end result is really critically important. And so we're not saying one or the other, but we're saying to be thoughtful about how organizations work together and being clear about where your particular solution or your particular set of skills fits inside of the wheelhouse or the narrative around making a racially equitable solution.
Okay, so next we're going to talk about a framework to understanding how racism exists. And this is really exciting for me because I love graphics, so thank you. So the first way that racism exists is that it's thought of to be personal. And so the best examples that we always say is like, it's both interpersonal, so the messages I receive about myself. And this can be for either white people or people of color. Typically, the messages that people of color receive about themselves are that they are not the dominant standard, and that equates to internalized oppression. The messages that white people receive often about themselves is internalized superiority, where they think of, I always give the example of like, if you always think that just like the way you look is the only standard of beauty, right? That is just like all of the messages you've ever received in your life reinforce that if you're blonde, that you are beautiful, and you don't even think about it, right? You might just like consider that. And so I think that is important because people often will say like, it's about internalized oppression and internalized superiority. And then like, it is just my internal work that I have to do. And that's it. But we would argue that also those intrapersonal, messages impact our interpersonal interactions. So Aj and I are two human beings, we're in an interaction, and something happens. And one of an example I like to tell people is like, when we think about interpersonal racist actions, we always think about Paula Deen, right? Like we're always looking for the racist in the room so that we can be like, I'm not that, right? First, it's always around proximity. So I don't use that kind of language, or I'm not doing that, so I can't be racist. And when we leave a conversation about race, just in the personal box, what we actually miss is all of the ways that the next box happens, right? So institutional, the policies, the practices, and beliefs that are baked into the institutions that impact our life. So one of the ways that I always think about this is that there are 4 ways that institutions regularly and predictably oppress people of color, right? They exclude. So an example of that would be academia. When you look at the number of PhDs of who are people of color. Healthcare, they underserve. We're just like, we live in Washington, D.C. There's no maternal health care east of the Anacostia River, where the majority of people of color, majority of Black people live in the city. And then the third is exclude, right? So we're just going to completely leave you out. And then the fourth is exploit. And so all of the ways that our institutions do those things create how individual institutions function, operate, and then perpetuate race-based disproportionate outcomes. The last is structural. So the structural is like if intrapersonal is to interpersonal, institutional is to structural, right? So structural is around how all of our institutions collude to maintain power in a few people's hands and to reinforce the negative messages that are happening in the policies and practices that exist. I often point out here that for the institutional and structural sections, like it doesn't actually need our help to function, right? Like those systems, the impact of redlining is felt. Now, does that mean that as individuals, we don't have a responsibility to disrupt those systems or create interventions that change the trajectory of our institutions and systems? Absolutely not. But I'm saying that in the absence of the intentional interventions, those systems will just continue to operate and produce, right, things that oppress, exploit, underserve, and exclude people of color.
So at their core, race and racism is about power, right? So we want to have a conversation about what that means. So when we're talking about power, wrong power. So when we're talking about power, a lot of times we talk about organized money and organized people. So when we're thinking about organized money, there actually could be a tendency for folks to think about organized money in a wholly negative way, right? Where people are like, oh, we're talking about corporations, we're talking about corporate greed. But we would offer that there also are examples of organized money that we're familiar with that we would generally consider good or positive, right? So philanthropy being a really good example of organized money where the money is organized to attempt to make an impact, a social justice impact, or just generally an impact in the lives of people who we frequently find ourselves advocating or organizing on behalf of. Then you have organized people, right? So this can look like a lot of the organizing institutions. It can look like, two examples that I have under here, so the Climate Justice Alliance or 1DC. It can look like an organization of organizations, right? Organized organizations who reach people. But it's essentially this people power versus money power conversation. There also is electoral power, right? So the power of people who are in elected positions of power. And what we would offer is that elected officials are in ways beholden to both, even though they're supposed to only be beholden to the people. We know the truth of the matter and just how it plays out practically, so it doesn't make sense to pretend like it doesn't, is that organized money can absolutely have an impact on those conversations. And so when we talk about power in terms of race and racism, it's also about the power and ability to decide or to make decisions about who comes into your neighborhood, to make decisions about what policies and practices should be passed or enacted or even thought about. It also, in a lot of instances, is the power even to just decide who you are, right? So who decided that you were white? Who decided that you were Black? Who decided that these are the ways that we call ourselves? So we just wanted to have sort of a little question that we're posing to you all. You should feel free to answer in the chat box. So what is this? And not rhetorical, you can totally type in the chat box. And I'm curious what people think this is.
It looks like a lot of people are saying chair or armchair or blue chair.
So it's a chair. A lot of people are saying it's a chair, an armchair. So how do you know it's a chair?
Someone said it's one version of a chair.
Ooh. Okay.
Experience.
Because
someone told me it was a chair.
Okay.
That's what we were taught.
Okay.
And it looks like other chairs.
Right. So there are these ways, I mean, because if I were to get up and sit on this desk, like sometimes people are like, oh, it's a chair because it's something you can sit on. And I'm like, well, you can sit on lots of things, right? But the answers around like, this is what we were told are more precise. And then I guess my third question would be, who decided? So who decided that it was a chair?
Somebody wrote the man.
I want to know who that person is. Stay up here for class. You get an extra point.
The collective, the designer, creators of the English language,
Okay.
the person who invented it.
Okay. So and all of those are like in some respects right? So it's about what it's about so yes, all of those things are correct. Someone essentially made a decision that this was a chair. So in the art world, the way that it works, and there was an exhibit that actually used this as an example. So there was a chair, like a physical chair, and it's funny that I'm even saying that given the example, and then there was a painting of a chair, and the question was, which one is a chair, and how do you know? And it was this sort of exploration around value and how value is assigned in the art world, which for anyone who is like an art collector, an art connoisseur, is very racialized, right? And is very heavily subjective, that there are decisions made about what pieces of art have value and what pieces of art do not. when it comes to race and racism, similarly, there are decisions made around what people have value and what people do not. And so there's this question around, okay, so there's this question around who gets to decide, who gives the power to decide, how do we generate meaning? And then the question of what do we do when that meaning is challenged, right? So when it comes to thinking about who has the power to decide, going back to Nicole's points around who decided or who made decisions around standards of beauty, who makes decisions around where things go. So thinking about affordable housing creation in terms of people who want to create housing, who decides what neighborhoods that housing goes in, right? Who decides what materials those things are built with? Who decides whether or not, those are built with union contracts or not? There are all of these ways that decisions are made for us, and we are just sort of, we are not necessarily privy to the decision making, but we sort of just accept them as fact. So I want to go back to when I was talking about power in terms of terms and how things are defined, but the power to define is really, really important because words matter. And it's important that if we're having a conversation about race and racism, that we talk about it. It's important that if we're talking about something that happens in a Black neighborhood, we're not saying like, oh, communities of color, if it's specifically a Black neighborhood, or if it's specifically a neighborhood where Chinese immigrants live, we should say Chinese immigrants. We should not just sort of group everyone together because it feels like the more comfortable thing to do. So what you received in your emails should have been a link to some key terms. And we actually are going to do a breakout room around some of these definitions. So Kathy's going to help us break people out into breakout rooms and just make sure that you have, the only thing that you'll really need is your definitions, the definitions that were sent around in the email ahead of time. And we want folks to answer 3 questions that we should have written on the slide, but it's only occurring to me now that we should have written on the slide. So the first question is, are there any reactions? So when you're looking at these terms, are they terms you were familiar with, or you're like, oh yeah, I already know these? Are there some that feel challenging? Are there some that are new or that you didn't know? Are there some that you don't agree with? And we want you all to have that conversation in your small group. The second question, or the second thing we want you all to think about is, looking at the definitions, how do some of these things show up in the work, right? So how do some of those concepts show up in the work that you're doing every day? And we want you to take about 7 minutes to have that conversation with one another.
And we would say that the other important thing to think about is like that the reason we are asking you all to try on these terms and to play with them and to think about them is because actually it is a resource available to you, that the ability to be in conversation and use the same similar language and to call out what is happening is actually a way that organizations reinforce the kind of culture that promotes racial equity, right? So when we see white supremacy at play, or we see biases showing up, the ability to name that, excuse me, I'm sorry, my voice squeaked. The ability to name that and to use common language to have those conversations actually gives organizations more power and access to move through conflict and to do that in ways that promote racial equity. Then organizations are like, well, I know that this is something that's happening, but we don't use those words here, right? And so we would ask you all to break out 7 minutes, talk about the terms, talk about your reactions to them, and then talk about how they show up in the work.
And Nicole, did you want groups of 5?
Yes.
Okay, great. So I will put everyone into groups of 5 and you'll have to accept it on your screen. So just give me 1 moment, please. And those breakout rooms are open, so please join when you can.
Hello. Hi.
Hi, did somebody just join us via phone?
Yes, this is Amina.
Hi, Amina. We are currently in breakout rooms right now for a few more minutes.
Okay, I thought I was in my breakout room. This is very confusing. I don't think I can hear anyone. Oh yeah, someone named Medina said she can't hear anyone either. Okay, I guess we'll do this via chat. All right. I will just talk to you back when we reconnect.
Okay.
Thanks.
Yep. Hey, Nicole and Aja, did you want me to send them like a 1-minute warning message?
Yes. Why don't we give folks 3 more minutes and then just like come back at 1:10 and at 1:09 we can send them a 1 minute.
Perfect. Okay, great. All right, should I close out the breakout rooms now? Okay. Everyone everyone has 40 seconds to get out of their room, so we'll just wait a minute.
So you like, yeah, just like signal me when you're like, let me know when you're done.
Thanks, love, and hair grease.
That is super.
Great talk.
Looks like we're going into the main session.
Oops, I thought we.
All right, everyone should be in now.
Great. All right. So maybe in the chat box, just say high level, a few things Kathy can read out around what came up in your groups. Being patient with technology and knowing the limitations of it, but also I hope that some of you also got to have some conversations and some of those things came up. So we'll give you a minute to just kind of like chat in the box and say, what are some of the things that you all talked about in your groups?
Would you like me to just start reading some of them out now?
Yes.
Okay.
I was like, is no one saying anything?
They're just coming in now. Okay, so group one, folks were familiar but either skipped over using the terms in everyday work or worked racially in homogeneous settings. Another group, resistance to dealing with the issues in the definitions on a deep level. Another group, it's powerful to see the definitions. It helps make the topics more real. How to address microaggressions in the day-to-day. Sometimes individuals are comfortable with using these terms, but bringing it to your organizational culture is even harder. Someone commented, it's interesting to me that the words from this cloud that remembered and the ones I didn't remember. We like the definitions, but would also like to use examples and apply to the IFA coalition specifically. Someone was not sure how and when to use the definitions. Experiencing things, but not having a name for it until now. The people that we serve may not necessarily be the people that are in the discussion. A question was, how can we use this in our meetings? How can we learn to notice how whiteness works in our interactions? The terms are familiar, but deeper level provided insights. Avoid skating across the top. There's a general gratitude for having these terms explained in a clear manner, acknowledgement that we need to make distinct connections between the topics, terms, concepts, and specific challenges in the energy and housing sectors. Our organizations have high-level strategic goals around diversity and inclusion, but we lack actual practices and procedures for dealing with the day-to-day. This is why we joined today's webinar, the intricacies of language and their connotations. We discussed some of the definitions we're more familiar with and others we're less familiar with or hear used less often. We also discussed how some of these definitions get misused or used differently, such as intersectionality and whiteness. Somebody learned about the term intersectionality. And then the words show that the edict by Martin Luther King, that we know people by their character, is not addressed. Our group appreciated seeing these terms defined and reflected on the fact that some of them, especially intersectionality, are popping up more frequently in their work and lives.
Wow.
And then 2 more comments.
Oh, okay.
Somebody didn't get to say this in their group, but the conversation about power, the definitions was really helpful. I expect many leaders in the nonprofit world don't feel like they have power, but they do. And then there are 2 more comments. Should I keep going?
Last two.
Last two.
Okay. White supremacy is a very charged term. I think a lot of white people agree with the definition, but would not call that white supremacy. White supremacy is a very charged term linked to Nazi and neo-Nazi, an extremely violent outcome. And then lastly, organizations have internal resistance to addressing the words on a deep level. They are acknowledged in a superficial manner.
So you all really got into that exercise. We would encourage you to continuously go back to this, right? So, Aja, do you?
Yeah. So there's actually a working group, and I talked about it a little bit earlier, but a subgroup of the equity working group who's working on terms specifically. And I see Isabel. Hey, Isabel. I see that there are folks from that subgroup on here. And one of the things that we'll note is the ask. I heard the request for so maybe examples. So like that's something that we can think about when we're building out the glossary. And again, it'll be ready for debut in May. So when you come to the convening, be sure to check out the pre-training, the pre-convening training, and then also the our workshop, which will be sort of a more in-depth training around race, racism, and how it operates at IFA and NEWHAB in particular. So yeah, so glad that that was a good exercise for folks, and glad because we're always as facilitators happy when natural segues happen, because one of the things that we did want to talk about and hit on is sort of so people when they hear the key terms, a lot of times even when they're getting on the webinars are like, oh, we want to start having conversations like these at my organization, right? We want to start having these conversations, and we heard it in the feedback, people being like, but how? So one of the ways is you could convene like small groups of people. So if you're on this webinar with other people who are at your organization, or other people at your organization who are on this webinar, just getting together and having that conversation, like getting together and perhaps like reading an article. And at the end of this, we'll send out our resource list that has a list of articles and different books and things that we offer as recommended readings to help folks. And then in general, just the more that conversations are had around race and racism, and the more comfortable each of us gets with having these conversations in the workplace and really thinking about how they relate to our work, just the easier it will get, the more obvious it will become. There can be this desire to want to get it all and get it right on the first go. And, this is even an ever developing field, even for us as facilitators who are supposed to be the experts in this field. The field is ever developing. And so, but for the ability to continue having conversations and continue talking through what these things mean and how they show up, we wouldn't be able to be comfortable with using the terms and defining the terms either. One of the things that you can look out for, and Nicole's going to talk about this in a second, is also avoiding some of the pitfalls or the detours that happen when at organizations we try to have conversations about race, and then it feels like, so some of the comments that people gave was like, oh, organizations, yeah, we talk about these terms, but on a superficial level. So what Nicole's going to explain is some of the ways that organizations and individuals can avoid some of those pitfalls.
Great. So this work came out of Joan Olson's work on detour spotting, and it's a great resource. I recommend. We'll send it and include it in our resource list, but it's developed out of 18 kind of ways that people detour, particularly for white folks who detour from conversations around race. And I say that because I think that it's really helpful to think about, like, if there's a lot of energy around having a conversation, right? One of the things that we can often do is that we can get really excited by having like a experience like a webinar or a training, and then forget the ongoing work and self-evaluation that needs to happen in between time to help us become more self-aware. And what we would argue, right, is that it is often that oftentimes we take our cues that white people take their cues about how to behave or how to have conversations about race from people of color. And I would say that particularly in the workplace, is something that people need to opt into and consent to. But what you can take responsibility for and what people can take responsibility for is their own self-learning. And so this resource is helpful in that it gives some ways to be able to look at when conversations about race emerge, what are the default tendencies in me to default to some of these things that make a conversation not about race. So the first thing that Joan argues is a big detour is that I'm colorblind. And that comes out a lot of the times in microaggressions that are like, I don't see you as Chinese, right? Or I don't see race, which for me, right, and my experience as a Black woman is shaped by who I am is shaped by that experience. And so in some ways, when you say, I don't see color, what you are often saying is like, I don't see you and your full humanity and who you fully are. The second one is the rugged individual bootstraps mentality. I think there's a lot of examples in the news about this idea that, America is the land of opportunity and all you have to do is work really hard we oftentimes it's referred to as like the myth of meritocracy, right? Where it's just like, oh, well, I got a small loan from $1 million from my father to like start my company, right? I'm not going to be political on this webinar. We're just talking facts. And I can't help it. And so, but that kind of like, oh, well, everyone has an equal playing field, right? But when we even think about like housing and the legacy of redlining currently in conversations about redevelopment of communities, particularly communities of color, like that is the playing field really equal. The third is reverse racism. So oftentimes when conversations emerge about race and race relationships, you'll hear people say, well, that's just reverse racism. Particularly, you'll hear that a lot in conversations about, what is it when you get into college?
Affirmative action.
Affirmative action, right? And so I would say that is a way that people detour from conversations around race. And then I would say the fourth one that feels really important is innocent by association. So when people are like, I can't be racist because I have Vietnamese friends, or I'm not racist because my daughter is Black, right? That those sometimes are ways that people use proximity to people of color to disguise or not deal with the ways that their life have been shaped by messages of internalized superiority. And I would say the sixth one that will feed really nicely into our next slide and our next conversation about organizations is like the white knight. So typically, I always give the example, I worked in a community and we would have groups and they would say, oh, we're gonna come and pick up the trash, right? Like we wanna volunteer and pick up the trash in your neighborhood. And I would say, well, there are people who do that, right? And if people want to do that, they will do that. And groups will be like, but it's an environmental issue, right? Like that people are littering, and it's like, no, it's not necessarily. It's like people don't always, the city doesn't pick up trash in the same way in some communities, right? And so I think sometimes they're like, we're gonna build your community center for you, right? You don't have the capacity to do that on your own. And so I think particularly for organizations that are trying to be anti-racist, or for organizations that are used to doing direct services or advocacy, that white knight kind of missionary framework can be really a little bit of a double-edged sword, like, right? Like you want to do good work, and what are the ways in which doing good work further prop up your dominant cultural norms and ways of doing things that exclude people of color and other cultural reference points.
So let's go back to that slide on power. So there's organized money, there's organized people, and a lot of times what we can do is be like, okay, so where does that leave our organizations, right? Where does that leave advocacy organizations? So, and one person said it in the feedback, so advocacy organizations and institutions do indeed have power, right? That when we think about campaigns, like advocacy organizations build campaigns, right? Decide what sort of issues they're going to tackle. Our organizations get resources, and then organizations decide how those resources are spent. So that it is important, and I appreciate the person reflecting this from the breakout conversation, but it is important that we remember and recognize that our institutions absolutely do have power, that advocacy organizations and organizing institutions, along with direct services institutions, all have power, and it's important for us to consider race and racism and racially disparate outcomes when we're making decisions. And we'll have a conversation about that in just a little bit. So advocacy, organizing, and direct services. Oh my. So advocacy, we just want to start out with a few definitions. And these are just like basic baseline definitions. They're not like the super comprehensive, So advocacy, at its core, is speaking or arguing on behalf of other people, right? And I know that there are a lot of organizations who do great work in the IFA network and in the NEWHAB network that are about advocacy, right? About speaking out about the issues that folks are experiencing. There's community organizing, right? So, which is more so organizing local residents around a common goal to promote the interests of their communities. And then we have direct services, which put simply is providing a service directly to the people. So thinking about National Housing Trust, right? As an organization that's like, yep, we're gonna go out and make sure that housing literally gets built. So thinking about those three sort of sectors. So which of these is better or the right one? Like which of these is the right way to go? In the chat box, please. If you had to choose.
Someone said all. Someone said number 2. Number 2. Somebody asked for what?
Oh, for what? Like which? Okay, I get it. Just period. Like if you were like, oh, I want to accomplish a goal, which of these 3 would be the way to go?
A couple people said all are necessary. All provide value.
Sweet. So perfect. You did not get tricked by the trick question. Because that's absolutely right. That at their best, right, advocacy, organizing, and direct services all actually work together, right, to build community power, to create policies that change people's material conditions, and to provide direct services that the community articulates that they want and need. And that part feels important for direct services as a person who comes also out of a direct services organization, that it isn't just about the direct service that I decide the community needs, right? That, and we can have a conversation about why that's problematic. And the same for organizing. It isn't that I'm gonna go in and organize around the thing that I've decided that the community needs to organize around, right? It's all at the core of all of these, and all of these done best, are done best when they're done together. So we have a visual to sort of illustrate that. So here we have advocacy in this brown bubble, right? Advocates create campaigns primarily to get policies passed. When that's done absent organizing, when that's done, or absent people, when that's done absent organizing or direct services, right? You run the risk of doing it in a way that's out of touch with people's actual desires or needs. And organizing, similarly, when done by itself, you can build community power, but when done absent some of the tools that make sure that policies are passed or things that are passed that can really codify the things that the community is fighting for, it can feel really anemic. Those two things together, though, mean that you can get policies drafted and organized around and advocated for in ways that build power. And when you add in direct services, right? So if you're just providing direct services with the primary goal being getting people's immediate needs met, yeah, their needs are met for the day, but it doesn't do anything to address the rest of the stuff. when you're doing all of these things, all three of these in conjunction, right? So advocacy, organizing, and direct services, when campaigns, I should say, not in organizations, are doing all of these three things together, then you end up with really powerful campaigns that build power, that advocate for and implement transformative policies, and during the campaign, people's needs are met. And we don't propose that organizations then say, okay, how do I as an organization make sure I'm doing all three of those things? It's impractical, and frequently no one organization is set up to do all three of those things well. It really is about how we build relationships and build partnerships, recognizing that having all three of these components are critical, right? And I know that a lot of the conversations, at least in the preliminary interviews that we did, were about how we do that. Some of that is about how and when we make decisions about when to partner with people. So as an organizer, I can't even tell you the number of times advocacy organizations waited until the very last minute and didn't actually want organizing institutions or organizers to have input on anything, but really just wanted us to turn out people. Same as a person who works in direct services. It'd be like, oh, I know you work at this organization that sees 30,000 people a year. Can you send me, 5 people over the age of 62 who have, had an interaction with AARP, but also with the criminal justice system, and have 2 kids under 2, right? There's like all of these like very specific things, and advocates would come to us at our direct services organization and would be asking for that, but would not be asking for us to have input sort of on the front end, or asking us to leverage our connections and relationships with the people that we served on the front end, so that there didn't need to be sort of this mad rush at the end to get impacted people bought in or involved in the process. And a lot of and really it's about, and when we talk about power, that for organizations, it's about the power to decide when there are all of these points, when there are these sort of like choice points or points where it's time to make a decision about who we partner with, or time to make a decision about how we're spending resources, or time to make a decision about how we choose an issue, or how we even cut an issue or message an issue. That all of those are places where we can be thinking about how advocacy, organizing, and direct services work together to really amplify the impact of the work that we're doing.
And I would add that one of the other things to think about is that when we operate in isolation, as if we have the only solutions possible to solve the problems of the world, actually what we do is we reinforce more of the status quo. And that actually, if we're talking about becoming organizations that are learning organizations, or organizations that prioritize racial equity, it requires us to think holistically about the solutions that we're generating, and to ask difficult questions of us. It also does, this is not to, I don't want to sound like, I don't want us to be like sound, I was going to use the word Pollyannish, but that doesn't make sense. I don't want us to sound like naive, that this is not, that these asking organizations to think differently about the work that they're conditioned to do is easy, right? But that actually requires thoughtfulness, it requires trust, it requires intentional relationship building. So you can be an existing advocacy organization with a long history of being like, we just get the policies passed, like we're not thinking about organizing, or we're not even thinking about implementation and how people who are directly impacted, how they're going to get the service. We're just thinking about like strictly our bucket. And that when you think in this framework, you might go to an organizing group and say, I want to partner with you. And they might be like, they might laugh you out, like they might be like, I don't trust that what you say is true. And then the question is like, are you going to be committed to racial equity and to building transformative relationships and partnerships, even when the first answer is no, right? And I understand that there are competing demands on our time, right? Resources are limited. But if our organizations has a stated commitment to racial equity, then our organization's metrics of success and our organizations will prioritize the time that it takes to build the kind of trusting relationships that allows for the center bucket to happen.
And that feeds into the question, or that sort of can be part of the answer to the question that people had even when we're doing interviews around, well, how do we know when we're doing it, right? How do we know when we're doing it well? And it really just depends on how organizations set markers. So if right now most of the organizations that you work with are white-led, don't have really actually a lot of interaction with people in the communities that you're trying to serve, one metric might be, a goal of being, we didn't have any at the start of this process, but then as we went through it, now we have 5 partners, and not just having partners, and if you were to ask those 5 partners about the quality of this partnership, they would talk about how we share power intentionally. They would talk about how, even though we can't provide financial resourcing, we're thoughtful about what are maybe some of the other things, the non-monetary things that we can provide. They would talk about the fact that instead of, we used to come to them at the last minute, bless you, but now we come to them at the beginning, right? And there's an organization called Bold that talks about it as good gossip. So you'll be able to tell the things that are changing a lot of times, because when we ask some of the same people who did not really have good interactions or positive interactions with organizations in the group, they would be able to talk about the quality of those relationships changing, right? We used to not have anyone who was from the community ever involved in these conversations. But over time, through making shifts, because it's also important that organizations don't just go, okay, we're just going to invite people to the meeting. And then you still have a dynamic where people who are impacted come to the meeting and are wholly deferential to all the people in the room, are just like talked over, are discredited. Their ideas are sort of met with incredulity. They're infantilized. So being able to look at those things, and part of what's necessary, and this is, I think, the part that I don't know if people understand what they're asking for, because I'm like, well, part of what is required in order to accurately assess progress is that we have to also accurately assess where organizations are. And so we can talk about that. And I really do hope that people are planning to come to the convening, because we'll talk really a lot about that, about how to run sort of like impact assessments and be able to assess our own organizations and see sort of like where we are sort of like using a list of metrics and being able to move ourselves along a continuum. Move ourselves along a continuum. So one of the things that we wanted to be able to discuss, and this is a segue to that, are 2 organizations that we've worked with that were able to move themselves along this process. And neither one of them are perfect, and they're 2 different types of organizations. So one is a direct services organization, the other is a coalition-based organization. They're both based in DC. And they both had been sort of undertaking these questions and conversations around race, racism, and how it impacted organizational work. So the first is Bread for the City, which, for full disclosure, I also work at Bread for the City. And when I first started working at Bread for the City, there was a group called, it was the Let's Talk About Race group, and it was a group of people who met pretty informally because there was a challenge from clients. So Bread for the City is a direct services organization that serves around 30,000 people a year in DC, all people living on low incomes at or below 200% of the federal poverty line, excuse me. So Bread for the City had started having these conversations because clients and staff alike had said, this is what we're experiencing, right? Like, I come in here and either I'm not treated with respect, like some people would say, or some people were like, it just doesn't make sense that it feels like there's a white center and a black center, because there were centers, one in Northwest and one in Southeast. People would say, had critiques around the ways that decisions were made. They were like, it's not transparent. It feels like their decisions are made and the clients are just told about them. No one like asks us, is this the thing that makes sense? Is this the thing that we want? Is this the thing that we need? And so the group started out by having these conversations around race. And the group of people were people who were across the organization. So both in terms of program, and also in terms of like hierarchy, right? So people who are at different levels of leadership. And it included the CEO, because what was decided was that it was, the conversation was so important that whatever came of this group needed to be something that had space to change the structure of the organization or the way that the organization operated. What ensued was really a process of training. So the staff agreed, well, this group of people agreed and put forward to the decision-making body in the thing, in the organization, that that everyone on staff needed to be trained, right? So everyone needed to get an anti-racism training, just like everyone had an orientation, that we decided that anti-racism training and everyone having a shared understanding was understanding all the work that became mandatory. Claim to work at the organization, you went through orientation, but you also went through an anti-racism training. The second thing that happened was a move, and it was done with facilitators, but a move to get outside facilitation, to spend the money on that resource, and then two, to have those outside facilitators continue to work with this group of people to assess where our policies and practices that were not in alignment with our values. So Bread for the City had values. Yeah.
Somebody asked, how did you create a space for people to discuss openly?
So for the person who asked, do you mean in terms of like literally how was it just functionally how was it created, or do you mean almost like not like but how did you get it to be a safe space?
I think they asked, how did you create a safe space for people to discuss?
Yeah, so excellent question. So part of it was that this was done, people opted into this. So it wasn't a mandatory grouping of people. It was people who self-selected. And I say that that was important because it also meant that people didn't feel like, oh, I'm being forced into this conversation about race and racism, and I'm being forced to have this discussion like with the CEO. One of the other parts of it, and I'll say for anyone on this call who is a CEO or who's in a position of power, what was really, really critical about our CEO and continues to be critical about Bread for the City's propensity for organizational shifts is that he's a person who proactively said and continues to say, I am open to being wrong. And so even though we would argue with one another, or even though we would disagree, and some of those disagreements got kind of hot, he would proactively and continuously reaffirm that disagreement was not like grounds for firing. Like he would say like things really explicit like that. And I think that it was important because he didn't used to. So even that was a shift. He didn't used to, but some of the feedback that he got was like, oh, people don't want to have this conversation in the room with the CEO, right? I don't want to say these things that the organization feel racist. Like I don't feel safe having that conversation. But him continually and proactively doing that meant that eventually the space opened up in such a way that safety was created. So it didn't, like the level of bravery that was needed in order to share candidly in the space didn't just like happen, right? There is no magic bullet for that, but it was co-created by the people that were in that room. And part of what was helpful to co-creating it was the continuity of the space. So the fact that one, the space was literally physically created. And what happened was if you, and this is important too, so if you came to that meeting space, you were compensated, and not as in you were paid to come, but as in, because we have people who work hourly, and we would have them sort of after the organization, after we had closed on Fridays, officially we closed at noon. And so it'd be like, oh, if you stay after, so if you stay till noon, or if you stay after noon, you can count it as work time, right? So it was an intentional space that also was recognized as critical to the mission of the organization. Supervisors were encouraged to let staff attend. So we had people who were, because direct services means you're working with people all the time, and people were like, I don't know, when can I take a break from the front desk? And so it was a proactive move to say, oh, this thing is just as important, just like they would get to be off if they had new member orientation, new staff orientation, or another training. They were supposed to be able to have time. The guidance was given to supervisors that people were to have time to come to these meetings if they wanted to. And the meetings were only once a month. So it wasn't like, some inordinate amount of time that was being dedicated that would have a negative impact on the direct service work. But there were all of these ways that, and I would say really intention is what it was about. There was this intention laid out around making sure the safe was space and making sure that it was accessible.
And I would add, one of the things I think that's really important to highlight from what Aja just laid out for you all is that the space is only as safe as it is co-created to be, right? So if the CEO of the organization had been like, yes, I'm open to feedback. Yes, I'm open to feedback. And people had never given that direct, honest feedback, then I don't know if the organization would have moved as far along as it did. And so I think that one of the things that we all have to take responsibility for is that sometimes it's so much easier to have a side conversation about something that you observe in the organization that has a racial impact on you or other people, right? And those conversations are even more critical to bring into the large space. And that is around a calculation of cost, right? And I would also argue that one of the things that we see in organizations is that the burden to make the organization aware of where it's falling short on where its values is aligned isn't just on the people of color within the organization, right? That is everyone's responsibility. If we are to be an organization that says that actually we all have a responsibility in being a racially equitable organization, then it cannot just be on the people who are sometimes on the receiving end of the harm or the offense to bring that to the space. And so I think that goes to how do you have these conversations in spaces where there's all white people? It's the same way, right? Because people decide that this is important and this is a value and we're committed to it, and they bring those conversations together in order to think critically and differently about how it's doing. You're not always waiting for a person of color to be in the room or to call the conversation that needs to be had. Yes, saw your hand.
Somebody asked, I can see how self-selection helps create a safe space to explore racism, particularly when there's encouragement from management, but doesn't it create a further divide or exacerbate the bubble effect?
So it could, right? So at first, it was a very white heavy group, and there were not actually many, even though we had plenty of Black and other people of color on staff, there were not necessarily plenty of Black and other people of color on staff who were part of this group. And a lot of that had to do with exactly the question around safety, right? It was oh yeah, sure, this is a white heavy group and our CEO is Black, but almost everyone in the group was white aside from him and when I started, me and then one other attorney. And it was oh yeah, sure, these white people want to hear me talk about how racism impacts me. Yeah, okay. And what we decided was it was intent, right? So it was okay, I have relationships with other Black people at work. How do I have a conversation with them? But we sat and we literally made a list of who's missing from the room. And then we were okay, we developed an outreach strategy. And part of that is because I'm an organizer. So so I'm always kind of who's in the room, who's missing from the room, how do we get them in the room? But I think that those 3 questions are just, are really good, period. So that, wow, so it's the bubble effect. I'm looking around, it's all white people, and maybe it's even all white women. And we're okay. And maybe it's yeah, all people who want to have this conversation, but it's people I could have guessed were going to be here anyway. And part of the question is okay, who's in the room now making that assessment? Who's missing? So who do we need? And not just oh, we need some more Black people, period. But who are people who have, where their perspective is missing, or where, remember so-and-so had this issue. I wish that she would be a part of this conversation. or oh, remember so-and-so, isn't he over this program that that we decide could have some impact? How do we make sure that he's in the room? And then we literally like broke it out, and people responsible for reaching out to those people and bringing them into the space. So yes, it does run the risk of creating the bubble effect, and that for every intervention, there has to be, with every intervention point, intentionality around, well, one, there has to be evaluation, and then intention around sort of like rectifying to make sure that you get the intended result. I hope that answered the question. And I could talk for a long time about Bread for the City and sort of the process, but it's still going on. The work is still going on. It has been really iterative, and at every point has been about the cycle that was like identifying an issue, working to work through it, evaluating, and then sort of like moving through that process over and over and over. And setting up a set of norms. So we have a set of norms that sort of guide how we have conversations with one another. So like assuming the best intentions, committing to non-closure, right? So this idea that we may start a conversation that produces more questions than answers, and that's okay, right? We're not gonna feel like that means failure. We're gonna feel like that means it uprooted some other things for us to talk about.
Yeah, I was gonna also say to the bubble effect, like I think two things that I would say that feel really important is like, you can't wait until everyone's ready, and you also can't just like, you can't just like, I think that is something that organizations struggle with, of like, but what about the people who don't want to have this conversation? And I think that some of that is like, as the organization defines what the work is for itself and how it sees itself becoming a more racially equitable organization, then people have choices in that, right? But like, I think that there's this idea that everyone is always going to consistently agree, or that should even be the goal. And I think that is actually a downfall of moving organizations into conversations about how to be more racially equitable, is that we wait for everyone to be ready, or we wait particularly for people in, like for people to consent. And I would say that that's a conversation around the culture of the organization. And like, I heard a quote that says like, culture eats strategy for lunch, right? So like, if you could have an amazing strategy, and if the culture is not indicative of implementing that strategy, it just like, it goes away. And so I think that one of the things that I would say is like a committed leadership and a committed group of people who want to carry the work are actually make the difference in organizations. And I think it's just a matter of knowing what the work is for you all, right? Like that for every organization represented on the phone, it might look slightly different, and creating a plan for your organization is really important.
And I would say that for organizations because we definitely have worked with organizations who were like, oh yeah, okay, great, you had a bought-in CEO. And let me tell you, I'm not even gonna lie, having a bought-in CEO made the process 90% easier than if we were an organization that did not have buy-in from the CEO, okay? Because some of the things that he could do, he could make unilateral decisions, like wave his magic wand like Tinkerbell, and now everyone has to go to training, and we didn't have to have a discussion about it. We didn't even have to fight about that, right? Because we had convinced him. Yes.
Somebody else commented in question, it seemed that there needs to be a strong goal statement established prior to these conversations to help bring people back to a common ground when the conversation starts. Did you have this kind of core goal?
I would say in some organizations, it starts out as a, like, for example, it can be done differently. I think Asha can speak to the specifics of Bread, but I've seen it in other organizations where it starts off as like a learning group, or like a book club where people are reading something and talking about what's happening. And I don't say that to like, be like, oh, just start a book club. I say it as like, I think that people often wait for spaces to be created for them instead of taking the onus and saying like, actually, I'm committed to having these conversations. I'm committed to having them with my colleagues. I'm committed to seeing how this shows up at our work. And often doing that in a way that feels not as high stakes is to ground that in some external piece of news or some literature. But do you want to speak?
Yeah, I mean, so for Bread for the City specifically, that's actually exactly how it started. So exactly how it started was being able to just come back together and have conversations. There was not a specific set of goals, right? Not at first. The goal was, and that's why the name of the group was Let's Talk About Race, because part of it was like, we didn't have, our goal was creating a space or creating a series of spaces where staff at Bread for the City could have open conversations about race, racism, and how it impacted us both personally and professionally. What came of that, what came of those conversations was movement toward, okay, so if we want to sort of move away from the personal stuff and say, okay, here are resources people can use to work on the personal stuff, sort of like at home or on their off time, how do we then as an organization, what are the things we need to look at to see where race and racism are playing out? And so, and this is actually moving us beautifully into the next point, the next part of our presentation. But we're like, okay, policies and practices. That was, what are our policies that may uphold racially disparate outcomes, right? Or may hold racist stereotypes. What are our hiring practices? Like if one of the things that was stated was that on the lower level, it was very Black, but then like in mid-level management was incredibly white. And so it was like, well, what are the opportunities to diversify sort of that middle rung? And looking at, okay, how do we make hiring and firing decisions? Like, how do we make decisions around who gets to stay and who has to leave? There was a sort of a question around what it meant to be a direct services organization who essentially was benefiting, and I'll say that this required a level of honesty on the part of the organization. So what it meant to be a direct services organization who was essentially benefiting from the fact that there are poor people, right? That the reason why Bread for the City was able to be, at the time, $8 million organization was because people were giving us money because people were poor, right? But for that, we would not be getting money. And so having a conversation about what it meant, one, to reconcile that and to deal with that and to be honest about that. And then the second part around what does it mean then in terms of how we make decisions around how we use our resources was another like year-long facilitated process that resulted in the creation of an advocacy and organizing department. Yeah, I see a question.
So it looks like we have a couple minutes left. Do you have time for one more question?
Yeah.
Okay. Somebody asked, isn't it important to ensure that these conversations starts with folks like you to help guide the process? I've seen backlash from very well-intentioned work environments and people to talk about race, but we're not well equipped, and it can create the opposite effect.
Yeah, your own organization, right? And so at Bread, I'll say that to start the conversations actually didn't require a person. But what did require outside facilitation was when we started getting into okay, well, what should we do about policies? What should we do? Like when we had sort of identified preliminarily some buckets to work in, having an outside facilitator come and help us work through our impasses were really, really helpful for the reasons that you named. Although, yeah, not know if you were. Yeah, I mean, so having outside facilitation can be helpful, but it's not necessary. So just with our last couple minutes, we want to move just right into a conversation around choice points.
Yep. So what is a choice point? A choice point is a moment in time when it is possible to consciously choose whether to do something congruent or incongruent with your values. In terms of racial equity, a choice point provides an opportunity to do or not to do something that is value aligned and moves to the goals of racial equity. So those are very on-time questions you all are asking. Questions that we put up 4 that we think is important. And I say hiring and firing, and I think one of the things that I think is a tendency for organizations is to think about their internal racial equity work as disparate or or not disparate, as different from the work that they do in campaigns and advocacy and organizing or in direct services. So there's the work that happens, and then there's what happens in the organization. And people often will say, like, the work that happens external to our organization is more important to have a racial equity lens on than the work that's happening internally. And we would argue that those things are extremely interconnected, and that often what's happening internally or externally in your organization is in a symbiotic relationship, that they are linked. And so we said that there may be some conversation to think about campaign priorities and positions on issues, hiring and firing, deciding what groups to partners, that there is the opportunity to think strategically when you have those decisions to make about what it is you are doing and what it is you're choosing not to do.
And in the follow-up resources that you'll get an actual worksheet that will help you work through choice points. So you'll get that as a tool to help guide some of those conversations.
And I would say that this feels extremely important as an ending place, because I think that when we talk about a system of racism, right, that it's both personal and institutional and structural, that actually choice points represent the opportunity to make an intervention and to say, I'm going to make a different decision, or if I'm choosing not to make a different decision, that is done consciously and aware of the consequences and what you're further promoting. And so we would invite people to think about those, and this will be the starting place for our in-person session when we're with you all in a couple months. And so we hope that you will come see us. You all have asked some really good questions. Maybe we can take, we're at 2:01. I know if people have to drop off, feel free, but we can maybe take another 5 minutes to answer any other closing questions that you might have, and then we'll promise to let you go at 2:05. But if you need to leave, please, I believe in time boundaries.
She's so on time.
So I'm like, I know that this is not all that you have to do. And Kathy, can you moderate for us?
Yes.
We'll take 3, maybe?
Yep.
Thank you, Aja Nicole.
Oh, of course.
Everyone is saying thank you in the chat box and great webinar.
Oh,
that's so nice. Oh.
Do another one.
We can.
We actually like in person better because I'm like, I can't see your faces, so like social cues are really important to me.
Yeah, somebody said thank you so much. A part 2 would be wonderful.
What would you want that part 2 to talk about? I'm just curious. Person.
Yeah, Amina and Esther, if you're still on, maybe describe what you'd like to see in part 2.
Mm-hmm. I think Amina is still there. I see her name. That's a prick on you.
Somebody just commented icebreakers for questions. There were so many questions. There was not enough time to ask them. A dedicated Q&A would be great. Would love to see more case studies with scenarios. Okay, so I think that's what part 2 would be, was love to see more case studies with scenarios.
Cool, that'd be really helpful.
Great.
Action steps, a continuation of these discussions and examples of the right and wrong way to proceed.
Yes, come in May.
Also more examples on how this can go wrong if not orchestrated in the right way.
We like to take our work from an appreciative standpoint, so.
It's like, let me show you how this can go wrong.
I mean, there's a lot of
some
ways it can go
examples.
wrong, but we can do that. Does anyone have any additional questions?
Great. Sweet. Well, thank you so much. Thank you for your feedback. We probably will send an evaluation out with when we send the resource list. We promised you the resource list, 2 worksheets, and the evaluation and the detours handout. So yeah, awesome, sweet. This was great. Thank you, y'all.
Thanks, everyone.